Hi folks. Sorry it's been so long since my last video, but I've been extremely busy at work. I wanted to get this up on YouTube, however, because one of the most frustrating things that I found when I was learning to work with Java server faces, Glassfish, and security is trying to figure out how to integrate Spring security with that tool set. And in this video, we're not going to talk about using Spring to take over the managed beans. We're just going to use Spring for security. And as you'll see, there are some good reasons to consider using Spring as opposed to standard security, which was the topic of the previous video. So without further ado, let's get started. I'm going to turn off the microphone here and going to present a couple of slides that'll kind of cover some of the issues, and then you're going to transition to a live lecture that I gave to a class at a technical college on this subject. So
let's start out with why you should consider using Spring and why you maybe shouldn't. So in general, it simplifies and extends the features and options developers have to secure their Java web applications. That's the main reason. A couple of examples. Using Spring, you can use SHA-512 as opposed to 256 in Glassfish. So it supports a higher quality algorithm. It lets you add a salt value to your hashed password, which is something you cannot do through the Glassfish administrator, which makes it more secure. You can add expansion to your hash to hash your hashes through multiple iterations, which again is something you cannot do directly through the Glassfish administrator. You have greater control and options for where you go in your site after logging in. Somebody asked about it, I think it was Mike or Andrew. One of you asked me about, well, in the demo that I did last time, you log in and it automatically takes you to the destination you were headed towards. Well, what if you don't want to go there? What if where you want to go after logging in is nowhere? You want to stay on the login page or on the home page or wherever you are. Well, with Spring, we can determine where you go next. There's no need for a JDBC realm. We don't need a realm anymore because that's all controlled by Spring now. That's a big deal to me. I don't like having to set up the JDBC realm. Granted, it's easier now that we have Joe's batch file, but it's still a pain having to bother with it at all. So we don't have to bother with it. In my opinion, and this is just an opinion, there's less configuration, and the configuration there is simpler. It works on any Java app server. What I showed you only works on Glassfish. You would use an entirely different technique if you were programming to Tomcat instead of Glassfish. Whereas if you use Spring, it's the same for every server. So it makes it more portable. However, one negative, other than the learning curve, is the fact that you are dependent on Spring. And that could be good or bad. For most of us, it's a good thing to be dependent on Spring because it gives us this extra power. But sometimes you'll be working for a customer or your boss or somebody that doesn't allow Spring for one reason or another. A common reason why an open source project like Spring would not be allowed is there's nobody to sue. It's open source. There's nobody to sue. If something goes wrong, you can't sue anybody. Companies like to be able to sue when bad things happen. So that's one example. Any questions about those basic ideas? All right. Again, and I said this last time, you're going to find that if you research this, and maybe Paul can back me up on this since he did some of his own research already, you're going to find lots of articles showing you many different ways of securing a Java web app. Some of them work, Some of them don't work. Am I right? And it's only by reading dozens of articles that you start to piece together stuff that works, and then most of it's trial and error. It'd be nice if there was one place you could go that had the right way to do things, but there isn't. And I ran into that, and you ran into that, and it's kind of a headache. And I think the reason that exists is because there's so many versions of Spring. There's so many different web app technologies you can use. There's JSF, there's servlets, there's Grails, there's Tapestry. There's all these different things, and they're not all compatible. So the technique I'm going to show you tonight works. It may not look like yours. You may have found a different way of doing what I'm about to demonstrate, but this is one way. It's not necessarily the only way. Learning Spring security is not trivial. It's a very large project. The documentation alone is many, many pages. These are just links to different sections. And this is not written to a beginner level. This is written to an intermediate to advanced level, making it all that much more difficult to learn from the official documentation. So typically what you do, and you're lucky, you at least have an instructor who can explain things to you and you have a sample project. I had to learn it totally on my own by all I did was I searched for Spring security. And I read every article I could get my hands on, and many of the articles talked about things that didn't work. So it was only after many, many, many hours of experimentation that I finally found a combination of techniques that worked. And now I've been using these techniques for going on almost 7 years now. And I've used it on many commercial as well as non-commercial projects. So I'm confident that when you do things right, it's a good production solution. So with that in mind, what I'm going to show you is how to get the sample project to work on your machine. What I did was, instead of creating a separate project, I created a new Git branch in the same project I gave you last class. So the project that I gave you last class is called JSF Secure. And what I did was I added a new branch to that for the Spring version. So you can switch between the versions. Now to use that branch, you have to update your copy. There's 2 ways you can do that. The first way is, if you still have it, go into it with Git, right-click on the project, go to Git, go to Remote, and do a pull. What that does, but don't do it yet. I have to show you one other thing. What that's going to do is, assuming you have the address of the project on my GitHub site, and if you don't, I'll show you how to find that address. If you have it, it'll pull down the new branch that I created. But before you do that, there's 2 things you have to know. First of all, whenever you do a pull, you're essentially merging in new changes with your existing code. And a merge will fail in Git if you've got uncommitted changes to your project. Now, even if you haven't modified a single thing, NetBeans has certain files that are private to you as individual users that do get changed from the original version that I gave you. So even if you personally haven't modified anything, you should still do what I'm about to do just to play it safe. You should immediately do a git add, which is going to add any changed files to the staging area. And after you perform an add, you want to go in and do a commit. When you do the commit, you should see at least one file listed in the commit dialog box indicating that something's changed. If you don't see anything here, then you don't need to do the commit. Once you've done that, then you can do a git pull, but be sure you right-click on the project name, do git remote pull. And if you don't see my J Lombardo username in the configured Git repository, then you'll have to paste it in here, and I'll tell you how to do that if you don't have it. So does anybody? And when you pull it down, at some point it's going to ask you which branches do you want. Select all of the branches. So if you get the address right and you select all the branches, it should start pulling down the changes to your project, and then now you'll have those new branches that I created. Once that's complete, you're going to right-click on your project one last time and go to Git, go to Branch, switch to Branch, and the branch you want to switch to is called springversion. But before you hit the switch button, you want to check it out as a local branch. So check this box and type in that same branch name here. And that'll give you a local version of the remote branch. Now I've already done that. I've already switched. All right, now if you have errors, you're going to need to do a clean and build, and it's going to take a while to download all the Spring libraries, so just expect to have to wait for that. While we're waiting for all that stuff to happen, I'm going to start explaining how this stuff works. The first thing that you'll be glad to know is there's no major architectural changes. This essentially is the same demo. It still has a login page, an error page, a home page. It still has a users directory and an admin directory. Those things are pretty similar. There's some minor code changes, but the basic architecture hasn't changed all that much. One thing that is huge that has changed is the database has changed. And here's why. If you look at the SQL folder under other sources, you'll see that it's going to need to recreate your database. So the database that you already have is called JDBC Realm, if you ran the script I gave you last time. But this time we're creating a users table and an authorities table. There's no groups table like there was in the past. Spring does allow you to use any database tables you want, but then you have to write a lot of customized code. If you use the recommended tables and the recommended fields, then you have less work to do. So that's the approach I took. Spring prefers you have a table called authorities, which is essentially your groups table. In addition, Spring wants you to have, in addition to username and password in the user table, Spring wants you to have an enabled field that is a Boolean indicating whether the account is enabled or not. The value 1 means enabled, the value 0 means not enabled. And that turns out to be a useful feature because it is always nice to be able to disable an account temporarily. So that's something we didn't need in our last version. Then the authorities table uses the foreign key username to join to the users table, and then it has an authority field that is the name of the role. Now the syntax for the roles, again, you have flexibility to use varying syntax, but again, if we go with the defaults, Spring prefers that you use in all uppercase role underscore and then some term. I'm using the term admin and member, so role admin and role member. And role member is the default in this case. I've also changed the username to an email address. Now that again is not absolutely necessary, but for this demo I wanted to show you that that's a wise thing to do, because then you have not only a username that's guaranteed to be unique, but you have an email address all combined into one thing. Again, not mandatory, but in this demo you have to use an email address for the username. So the passwords will have to be replaced with a new hash, which I'll show you how to generate. And as you can see, we have role admin and role, actually it's role user, not role member, so this is actually wrong. The default should be role user. So make that change. The default should be role user. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this into MySql Workbench so that I can do the same thing I'm asking you to do. Now, Dawn, I know you had trouble logging into MySql, so. Really? Well, that doesn't make sense. Sure. All right, I'm going to paste that script in and run it. All right, so I'm going to start with the POM. Because for you to use Spring, you're going to need to add some libraries. You're going to need to add some dependencies. So this is the same POM that you had the last time I showed it to you, but what I've added is I've added this Spring stuff, and there's a comment in the POM saying Spring Security Basic Libraries followed by a bunch of other Spring libraries. You should see all of these in your POM if you scroll down. In addition, I've added dependencies for Logback, which is a logging system, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And I've added some additional libraries that Logback and Spring need, such as SLF for J. So I've added a bunch of libraries, and then underneath repository, I've added a repository entry for the Spring Security Facelets tag library. So those are the main changes in the POM that get you the additional libraries that you need. Then we need to add some configuration. I'm going to start with the simple stuff. We're going to start with WebXML. Now, what you might remember from our last discussion is that WebXML had a bunch of security settings for things like login configuration and security roles. We no longer have to do that because all of that configuration has been moved into Spring. So you do not need to configure the security things. However, you do have to add, and you can only do this in source code, you do have to add these Spring configuration listener entries. So these are just interceptor objects that let Spring intercept requests and funnel it through its own security mechanism. So you already I've already put that in your WebXML. That's the only change to WebXML. Glassfish web.xml still has the security stuff that we entered in the other day. We're just not using it. Meaning that if you were to delete all this security role stuff It would not affect anything. But rather than delete it, I just let it be to prove to you that it's totally ignored. So there's no Glassfish web configuration required. There's no Beans XML configuration required. There is, however, a faces config entry. And this is technically optional. So, Paul, you may not have seen this in the stuff that you looked at, but what it allows me to do is I created a special class called login error phase listener. And what this allows me to do is if there's an error, a login error, as I'm logging in using a JSF page, it lets Spring intercept that and deal with the error in a way dictated by this class. So while it's not absolutely mandatory, it makes handling errors a little bit easier. So adding this to your faces config will enable that, but you also have to have the class, and in the source packages, you'll find under the utility package that login error phase listener. And you can see it implements the interface phase listener, which is a Java server faces interface. But it does use some Spring security classes as well. While we're in the utility package, you'll find several other utility classes, none of which are mandatory, and I'm just going to briefly describe them all. You should see faces utils. All this does is it lets you more easily add messages, whether they're error or success or general. It lets you add JSF messages more easily from your beans. It also lets you retrieve keys from a properties file, and it also lets you use something called flash scope, which I never use. So this is just a utility class that you may never need, but I find that it's really good for adding error messages. This class is a custom authentication handler that I wrote to solve the problem that Mike asked about what happens when you want to go to a different destination. This lets you override Spring's default behavior and target different destinations that you choose on your own based on how you want this to work. And I'll go into more detail on this later. There's a regular expression utility class that I provided for no special reason other than the fact that I was playing around with it. I found a sample from another guy on the internet, and I took his sample and modified it to suit my needs. If you don't use regular expressions, you'll never need this. If you do use regular expressions, you may find that this is helpful. And finally, the most important utility is this guy. This is the hash generator, which is different from the one I gave you last class, because this one uses a salt plus SHA-512, and it uses expansion through this iteration method. So those three features together aren't possible in the standard security. You have to use something like Spring to make that work. So the way you use this is you have to replace the clear text passwords in your database with hashed versions. So what you do is you enter in the username, which becomes the salt value, and you enter in the password, and then you run this program and it'll generate the hash, which I'm going to do right now. So this is the hash for Tom. That generates this very long string of hexadecimal characters, which you copy and paste into your database where that person's password is. So let me go ahead and do that. That's Tom's. So I'm going to edit the user table. And I'm going to replace Tom's password with the hashed version. And I'll do the same for the other two guys. So I got to do Bob, which is password 1. Run that again. Copy that hash into Bob's password. And then finally do Sally, which is password 2. Save those changes, run it again. Generates the hash, copy the hash, and replace Sally's password. And then apply the changes. So now I have the hashed versions of the passwords stored in my users table. Be very careful how you do that, because the first time I ran this, I must have pasted something in incorrectly and I couldn't get the users to log in. So there's your utility programs. Next, we need to complete the Spring configuration. For that, we're going to use this application context.xml file, which is under other sources. This is just a big XML file. This is how you configure Spring normally, using this XML. So here's what this is doing. Spring has these various tags for different purposes. And this one turns on global method security. I'm not actually using this capability, but if I were to use it in the future, I want to have it available. So this globally lets you secure methods by annotations. I'm not using that feature right now. This is optional. And what we're saying is there's certain things on the site I don't want to be encrypted. For example, I don't want graphics or CSS code to be encrypted. It doesn't need to be. It's not a security risk. So what I'm saying is anything inside the resources folder, these wildcards mean anything that's inside of this folder, I'm saying don't turn on security for those things. Again, this is optional. If you eliminate this completely, that's all right, but then everything will be secured. It's a good idea to leave some things unsecured, because if you have images that appear on public pages, you want those images to be available. If you turn on security, they won't be unless the people are logged in. Now, here's another area where we can take advantage of some of the automation built into Spring. We turn on this HTTP feature, auto-config equals to true. That means there's less code to write. We still have to do some things, but there's less to do by setting that to true. We also want to set the access denied page to whatever page we want people to go to when access is denied. And I've got that set up to the error page. We then need to set port mappings. In a web app, normally, if you're on a production web server, all non-secured traffic goes to port 80. And port 80 is the only port that doesn't have to appear in the URL of your website. But for development purposes, we usually use port 8080 instead of just plain 80. And we have to tell Spring that that's what we're using. And then that has to appear in your URL as well. For the secured pages, we normally would use 443 in a production environment. But in a development environment, we use 8181 usually. And we have to tell Spring what we're using. Without that port mapping, it would expect 80 and 443. Now, these intercept URLs is where we say certain content requires authentication. So what we're saying here is that any URL that has this pattern, that has faces in it followed by admin, that is a secured page that requires the admin role and the secure channel via HTTPS. And we're doing the same thing for users. Difference is that for the user folder, both the administrators and the authenticated users can get access to that. But again, it's a secured channel. And all other content is authenticated anonymously by Spring. What does that mean? Authenticated anonymously. It means that even though you haven't logged in, Spring treats it as secure content and will encrypt all the traffic, which is a good idea even for people who don't have to log in. Because the less you can expose to hackers that use sniffer programs, the less chance there is that somebody can mess with your site. But that again would be optional. So any questions about these first few settings? Yes? Yeah, the reason it's double, I had the same confusion when I first learned this, is that means files and directories. That's why. So that would enable you to have subdirectories underneath admin. Anybody? I can't remember. It might just be files at that level and not folders, or the other way around. I can never keep that. What's that? There is a difference. I would recommend you always use double asterisk, unless you, for some reason, don't want subdirectories. All right. Then we get to the login form itself. So the first thing you should notice is this login processing URL. And notice that it's different from what I showed you last time. Last time it was called JSecurityCheck. Now it's called JSpringSecurityCheck. That is actually the alias of a servlet that is included with the Spring libraries. So that's your servlet alias for how Spring does its security checking. And you'll see that's used in the form when we look at the form later. The actual login page you identify, as well as if you have a custom authentication handler, which I showed you earlier, this reference is to this alias down here. Right here. This bean reference, which points to that custom class that I showed you in my utility folder. So we tell Spring to use that. And then we say where to go if authentication fails, back to the error page. We also provide a way to log out of the system. So we tell Spring that if we log out, it should use this servlet. We should invalidate any open sessions, and we should go to the home page or wherever you want them to go. Yes? You still need a logout button, but when you hook up the button to this code, which I'll show you how to do, it'll kill the session. It'll kill the user session, which is a good idea. Yep. All right, now the next thing we need to do is, okay, all of the stuff we did up to here, all of this stuff is just telling Spring how the basic interaction with your pages should work. But this portion, this authentication manager, this is how you configure Spring's internal mechanism for authenticating users. And the main thing we're doing here is we're telling it how to encode your passwords. So the password encoder references a bean, which is down here. And this is the key to the salt and the expansion. This is a built-in bean that Spring provides, the SHA password encoder, but we have to configure it. And what this says is use the value of 512 for the higher grade SHA. We could set that to 256 if we wanted to. And for iterations, we're using a very large number, which is how many times it rehashes every hash. Now, the reason you want to do that is that hackers use automated software to bang away at your system, trying different combinations until they find one that works. Well, if they do 1 million hits, You'd be surprised how fast that can go on a modern computer. A million hits doesn't take very long. But if you make every million go through 1,024 iterations, well, do the math. 1,000,000 times 1,024 is a lot of hits. And it slows the hacker down to the point where it's not practical anymore to do it. So this is how you configure those extra features. But that's not the only thing we have to tell Spring to do. We also have to tell it, what do we base the salt on? The ideal thing to base the salt on is a random value that is constantly changing. So for example, I could use, I don't know, it's got to be something that can be reproduced though. It's hard to imagine a random value that I can remember for all these users. So what I did is I used just the person's username as the salt value. So the username plus the password, they get hashed individually and combined together in unique ways, making it harder for people to crack the password. So you can use anything, but I'm using something that I can remember easily, which is the person's username. And then the last thing we need is the data source. The data source is the alias to the connection pool. You still have to create your connection pools the way I showed you last time. And if you remember, we have this file called Glassfish resources, which is, I believe, where is it? Oh no, it's under setup. This sets up your connection pool. So if you just got this copy off of my GitHub site, you're going to want to modify this with the appropriate information about your database and your username and password. But the Jindy name is the alias pointing to this connection pool. And that's what we tell it via this entry right here. We tell it to refer to this alias in Spring, which is down here. And this points to our Jindy name. So that's how you get Spring to talk to your database. There's a couple of other miscellaneous things in here. There's a logging entry, which I'll get to later, but that's basically it. And even though you've never seen this before, I'm confident that you can look at this and make changes to suit your needs because it's not that complicated. It's pretty obvious that if you have folders with different names, you would make a change there. It's pretty obvious if you were using different role names, you'd modify these features. It's pretty obvious that if you have different error pages, you would change that. Different home page or a different logout page, you'd change that. It should be pretty clear the things that you would need to modify to suit your own needs. Do you agree? Do you think that this is pretty straightforward? It should be. Even if you don't understand how everything works, you can see where you need to make changes. So that's how you configure Spring Security. Now lastly, before I run this and have everything blow up in my face, I want to talk about logging. And then I'm going to show you the code in our web pages that you have to modify. Logging is sort of like, but not exactly, a replacement for system.out.println. You've all used system.out.println as a way to debug your code and see console output, right? The problem with system.out.println is it only outputs to the console. A professional grade logging tool can do all that, but can do other things as well. It can log to a database, for example, or a file. And depending on the tool you use, it can do crazy things like create log files every day, zip up a month's worth at a time, and after 90 days, delete those files. It can do all of that in an automated way if you have the right tool. Well, the tool I'm using is called Logback. Well, that's not the tool you hear about on the internet. Most people that research logging eventually get around to hearing about Log4j. How many of you have heard of Log4j? One, two, a couple people. Log4j is a fine product, but it's not the state of the art. The guy who wrote Log4j wrote Logback because he knew Log4j couldn't be enhanced any further. So I'm using a tool called Logback. There's a website for it. Logback. And if you read about it and read the documentation, you'll find out why it's such a great tool. So that's what I'm using. And I've been using it for a long time, and it's a great product. The way you configure it is you add this Logback XML file. And if we take a look at it, right now I'm not using a lot of the extra fancy features. Basically, what this does, and you'd have to learn the syntax for this, but this is the pattern that's used for output. And basically, it's using a date and a time and a level and a thread and some other things. And then you tell it where to go. In this case, I'm going to the standard output, which is the console. But you'll see I've commented out one for a file, so I could log to a file simultaneously if I wanted to, or even a database, or even a combination of those. But basically, without going into too much detail about this configuration, this is necessary to tell Logback how to function. Now, to use it, you'd simply have to have the libraries installed. And then everything is automatic. It logs output anytime good or bad things happen. And if you want to log your own output, you simply use the log classes instead of system.out.println. So for example, here, I think I can show you an example. Here's a class. No, that's not a good example. Let me find a different one. That's not a good one either. I got to find one that I actually use it on. Nope. Nope. Oh, here it is. Yeah. Here's the login bean. And what you'll see is that I've got this logger constant using this logger factory and the class name of the thing I'm logging. And this guy is what you use then to output to the console. And this says log, it has a debug statement, and then it's just a string value. Now remember that we can configure Logback to log to the console, but we can also tell it to go to other places, which right now I have disabled. But by using that capability, when you do this, it'll log to as many places as you want it to. And some people find it useful to put your log statements into a database so they're searchable and sortable and things like that. So it's a very powerful system, but basically you just get used to doing this instead of system.out.println. And to do that, you have to first set up your log object. Also, you're going to see this weird annotation, suppress warnings. The reason that's there, and by the way, that comes from another library I added from something called Find Bugs. The reason this is there is that this field is marked transient. What does that mean? Well, I commented on this in Advanced Java briefly, but you probably have all forgotten. Anytime you create a class that's serializable, you need to determine if all of your properties should also be serialized. And we don't need to serialize the logger object because it's recreated every time you run the program. So there's no need to store that on disk. And marking it transient means don't serialize that. This little annotation says ignore the errors that this is going to generate. This is going to warn you that you've got a transient field in a serializable class. Are you sure that's what you want to do? And just ignore that. So the main thing is establish your log object, and then use that instead of system.out println. All right, now let's get to the web pages. Here's the home page. And the only thing I modified was I added a logout link. Now, it could have been a button, Dawn, but I decided to use a link instead. But again, it could have been a button. But I also have some JSTL. I'm not sure you can all see this. I have a JSTL tag, which I'll explain in a minute, and a Spring tag. So let's see what this all means. First of all, this is the JSTL namespace that you have to use that JSTL code. And you have to have this Spring namespace to use the Spring tag. So those two additions would be on any page that uses those features. And what does this do? Well, it tests to see if the user is authenticated. If the user is authenticated, we want to display their logged in name. So the user principal is their name. It contains the name of the person who logged in. That's the username that comes back. And then I have a logout link allowing that person to log out. But none of this gets displayed if the person isn't logged in. So this is a way of saying, if they're logged in, display a logout link, but if they're not logged in, don't display a logout link. Kind of a cool feature. Now let's go to the login page. Oh, and by the way, notice too that we're pointing to that logout servlet that was configured in Spring XML. All right, then let's go to the login page. Here's the login page. Now, the main thing that's different is I'm using some prime faces components, not because I have to, but because I wanted to show you that this works with or without prime faces. Prime faces is just a third-party JSF library that gives you some cool features that aren't in standard JSF, like this growl component, which displays messages and some other things. The main thing is that we're still using JUsername and we're still using JPassword, just as we did in the previous example, but this time we're sending the output to a JSF bean. So the JSF bean has the property username and another one for password. And the reason we're doing that is it's going to be the bean that does the login with some help from Spring. So whereas in the previous example I didn't use JSF for the username input or for the password input or for the submit button, now I'm using JSF for everything. So let's look at the login bean. The login bean also has logging support. But the main thing is, what happens here is it gets the JSF context object. It uses that to get the HTTP servlet request, which then I use to dispatch or forward the request to whatever destination we want. And to do that, it sends a username and password to this servlet that Spring provides with a copy of the username and password. Then we simply execute the forward operation, and then we're done. In fact, we don't even have to return anything, just null. What happens when this gets submitted is it goes to our custom authentication handler, and if the authentication was successful, it is this entry that determines where you go next. So the way I have it programmed right now is if you log in as a member, as a user, you go here. If you log in as an administrator, you go here. But Mike, if you want them to go to a common place, you could change this to point to any place in your website. So this is what gives you control over where you go next. So that's why we needed to do the login operation in the bean. I wouldn't need to use this at all for logging in if I wanted the default behavior that Spring provides, but that's going to force you to go to one place. This gives you the option to send people wherever you want them to go. Yeah. That's a different issue. What I'm talking about is if you have a website that, let's say on the home page, you have a login area somewhere on that page, and you want people to log in, but you don't want them to be sent somewhere. So when they log in, it just says, "Welcome back, Jim," and it doesn't send you anywhere. Right now, it will send you somewhere because I have it configured that way, but I could configure it to keep you on the same page. That's what I'm talking about. That's in the custom class called MyAuthenticationHandler. So that's where, this is where you decide where you go next, right here. So you would modify this to suit your needs. But what you were talking about is having separate entries for different customers. That's just different user accounts. And you could create roles. You could have, like say you have Acme Chemical as a customer and they get certain rights that other people don't have. You can create a role underscore Acme. You can, in other words, you can create whatever role names you want. But then you're going to have to configure that in your Spring configuration file. You're going to have to say, okay, if my customers log in, you know, first of all, what are they allowed to see? Well, maybe you have a folder called Acme or Customers or something. So you have to indicate that if you have a customer role, it's for this folder or whatever. And then, of course, those customers have to be in your database. So in your database, you're going to have users. So you might have, you know, John Smith as a user, and their password and their enabled status would be listed. But then under authorities, each user is granted certain roles, and this could be your customer role instead of the admin role. So, and if a person belongs to more than one role, then you need you have additional entries. All right, well, let's see if it works. It worked at home. I haven't tried it in the classroom. So let's go ahead and run it and see what happens. While we're waiting, this business of running the hash generator and pasting the hashed password into the database, that can all be automated in a production program where you have a registration mechanism built in that you're able to say automatically hash their password and store it that way using a JPA insert statement. Yeah. Well, the home page came up. That doesn't mean the rest of it's going to work, but let's see if the rest of it works. This also repeats some of the changes I made. So let's try logging in as a user instead of an administrator, and let's try Sally. This again is saying, you know, this is not a trusted certificate. So you have to, I'm in Firefox now, you have to add an exception. And then we get to the login page, and I'm going to use sally@isp.com, and her password is password2. And hopefully we get to the user page. And we did. So it's working. So you can see Sally is authenticated. She was redirected to the user page. Again, if you don't want to do that, Mike, you can adjust that configuration to go wherever you want. Notice there's also a logout link if I want to use it. I'm not going to use it just yet. And it also shows us who logged in. This would be great for something like welcome back, Sally, or whatever. Now I'm going to go to the home page, and I'm going to try to go to the admin section. Now remember, Sally's logged in, but she's only authenticated for user pages. So she should be denied access to the admin section. Let's see if it works. But it's not going to ask her to log in. It's just going to deny access. And it did. Sorry, access is denied. Your credentials could not be verified, or you are not authorized to view the content you desire. So it's working. Now I'm going to go back to the home page. I'm going to log Sally out by hitting way at the bottom a logout link. Then I'm going to try to go back to the admin section, and this time, because I'm logged out, it's going to take me to the login page because I'm not logged in. This time I'm going to log in as Bob, who is an administrator. Password 1. And it should take me to the administrative home page, which it does. And now I can go back home and go to the user page because administrators are allowed to see user pages. So you can see the authentication is working perfectly. What's that? We'll get to the bottom of your problems, but that's basically what this does. So let me, any questions so far? So let me review what you need to consider. Assuming you don't have problems like Mark has, but assuming you got it to work, what you're going to have to consider is this. The first thing you want to ask yourself is, what roles do I need for my users, for the authenticated users? Do I need an administrative role? Do I need a role for general users? Do I need a role for customers? What roles do I need? For every role that you need, you're going to need to have some users in your database with that role. And then you're going to have to configure your app via application config to reference those roles by modifying this config file. And you may need to copy and paste some additional, if you need additional roles, you'll need to duplicate this and modify it. But basically, this is where you decide what a person can do. So for example, here we say that if you're in the administrative role, you can see content in this admin directory. If you're in the user role, you can see content in the user directory. And if you're not in either of those two, then you can see anything else. So you'll have to modify this to suit your needs. The other thing you're going to need to do is decide, where do I go for the error pages? And where do I go for the home page? Or I should say, when you log out, where do I go? And where do I go for the login page? What page am I using for that? And then finally, in your that custom class that I gave you, this guy here, this is where you decide if they're successful in logging in, where do they go after they've logged in? So this says, if you're a user, you go to the user homepage. If you're an administrator, you go to the administrative homepage. But maybe I don't call this group users, maybe I call it customers, and maybe I don't want them to go to a customer page, maybe I want them to go back to the home page. In other words, you can send them wherever you want to send them. And then these variables are used in this if logic. So this says, if you're in this role, redirect to the admin target URL, which is this guy here. And if you're in this role, go to the member target URL. So you'll just have to modify this to suit your needs. If you have additional roles, you'll have additional lines of code, similar to what I gave you, and you'll have additional if statements. So that's basically the major things you have to consider. And then, of course, just little minor things like, do I want to have logout pages or logout links. So for example, on this home page, at the very bottom, there's a logout link. Maybe you don't want that, or maybe you don't want to display the user's name, or maybe you want this to be a button and not a link. Well, you can modify this to be a button easily. So those are some additional considerations that you'll have to think about. But basically, it's pretty straightforward. If once you get it working, and I know yours isn't working, but once you get it working, making the changes is pretty straightforward. But I recommend that if you're making any significant changes to server-side code, not the client-side stuff, but any server-side code, while you should be able to get away without doing it, I recommend you do a clean and build every time you change your server-side code. And the only reason I say that is that all these modern application servers are supposed to allow you to do what are called hot deploy edits. In the old days, you always had to restart your server, always. These days, you can get away with not restarting it. The problem is, if you don't, hot deploy doesn't always work. So what I do is, if it's a server-side change, I stop my server and do a clean and build. If you don't stop the server, the clean and build won't do anything. Now, it's kind of a pain to have to stop and restart your server, but in the long run, it actually saves you time, because every time a hot deploy fails, you're going to have to stop the server anyway, and now you've tried it twice, where you could have just done it once. So my advice is every time you do server-side code changes. Another thing I've seen happen, was it a Maven project?
It was.
I have seen situations where for Maven to download the libraries that are in the POM, it has to talk to what's called the central index that comes from the Maven central repository. And what NetBeans does is, the index is like a big lookup table. And what Maven does is it will download that entire index to your local computer. Occasionally that index gets out of sync with the main index on Maven's central repository. And when that happens, a clean and build can fail. But you'll usually see at the bottom that it's trying to download or update the index. Do you remember if you were seeing that? Yeah. Yeah. And finally, it can just happen because sometimes NetBeans, despite being a pretty good IDE, it isn't perfect. And sometimes it corrupts data and sometimes it fails. Not often. I mean, I've been using NetBeans for much longer than you. And I can count on one hand the number of times something like that's happened to me, but it does happen.
I've just reached the point now where I make a couple of changes that you build.
Or use git commit more often, so you can revert your commits.